Before we begin, if you enjoy story narrations like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss future ones.
The wind came from the east that night, a hard, dry thing that smelled of dust and old hay. It pushed across the valley like a hand, rattling the windows of the farmhouse and tugging at the loose boards of the barn until the whole structure seemed to breathe. For years the barn had stood like a dark tooth on the ridge behind the house, weathered planks, a sagging roof, and doors that the family never let anyone open. Neighbors told stories about it the way people tell stories about bad weather, quietly, with a glance toward the horizon. No one in the valley could remember when the rule had been made. It had always been there, as natural as the seasons. Do not go near the barn. Children were warned with the same tone used for rattlesnakes and thin ice. Strangers were told, politely and then more firmly, that the family kept to themselves. The family never let anyone enter the barn. When the storm tore the doors open, it was not a dramatic thing. There was no cinematic crash, no sudden revelation. The doors gave with a long, tired groan, and the wind pushed through the gap like a breath exhaled after a long sleep. The next morning, the sheriff's deputy who came to the property found the doors flung wide and a trail of footprints leading away across the field, footprints that did not belong to the family. What followed was a slow, careful unspooling of secrets. The valley watched as investigators moved in, as tape went up, and as the family's faces hardened into something unreadable. Old rumors were dusted off and held up to the light. New questions were asked. The barn, once a private, forbidding thing, became a public wound. This is the story of what was found inside and of what the family had tried to keep buried. It is a story of small towns and long winters, of the way people protect what they love, and the way secrets like roots can twist and choke the life out of a place. It is a story of travelers who vanished on lonely roads, of a family who kept a terrible promise, and of the slow, patient work of truth. The valley lay like a palm cupped around a river, a narrow green ribbon between ridges of stone and sage. In summer, it smelled of sun-warmed grass and diesel. In winter, it smelled of wood smoke and iron. Houses were spaced far apart, each one a small island of light in a sea of dark. People here measured time by harvests and by the comings and goings of the highway that cut through the county like a scar. The family at the center of the story, the Hargreaves, had been there longer than most. Their name was on the mailbox at the end of a long gravel drive, and their land had once been larger, before parcels were sold and fences were redrawn. The farmhouse was a squat, practical thing with a porch that sagged and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and cinnamon. The barn sat a little higher, half hidden by a stand of cottonwoods, its silhouette a constant in the valley's memory. People said the Hargreaves were private. They were also good at what they did, raising cattle, fixing tractors, and keeping their own counsel. They went to church on Sundays and to the feed store on Tuesdays. They paid their taxes and mended fences. They were not the kind of family that made headlines. That is why when the deputy called it in, the valley listened. The storm came in the night, a line of wind and rain that had been forecast and then downgraded and then, in the end, arrived with a ferocity that surprised everyone. It tore at the trees and sent shutters banging. The Hargreaves' dog, a brindled mutt named Maggie, howled until dawn. When the sun rose, the sky was a hard, washed blue, and the ground was littered with debris. Deputy Eli Mercer had been on the road before breakfast. He had grown up in the valley and knew the Hargreaves by sight. He knew the barn too, everyone did. He did not expect to find the doors open. The doors were not simply ajar. They were flung wide, one hanging on a single hinge. Inside, the barn was darker than it should have been, as if the light had been swallowed. There were tracks in the mud leading out toward the highway, and there were other marks, scuffs on the floor, a smear of something dark on the threshold. Eli called it in. He called the sheriff. He called the coroner. The valley, which had been a place of small certainties, began to feel like a place where the ground might shift underfoot. The first thing the investigators found was not a body. It was a map. It lay on a workbench near the back of the barn, folded and creased, with a coffee ring on one corner. Someone had drawn routes on it in pencil, lines that cut across county roads and back roads with little notations in the margins. Late night, stops, no signal. There were names too, written in a cramped hand. M. Alvarez, T. Reed, unknown. Maps are ordinary things until they are not. This one was a breadcrumb trail. It suggested movement, planning, and a knowledge of places where people could disappear. Eli felt the first real chill then, the one that had nothing to do with the wind. He had seen maps before, hunting maps, property maps, the kind of scribbled directions you give a neighbor. But this map had a different quality. It was a ledger of absence. The Hargreaves were called in to speak with the sheriff. They arrived in a truck that had seen better days, the three of them, Jonah, the father, Mara, the mother, and Caleb, their son, each with the same flat, guarded expression. They answered questions in short sentences. They said the barn had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. They said they had not been in it in months. They said they had no idea how the doors had come open. There was something in the way Mara folded her hands that made Eli uneasy. Jonah's jaw was a hard line. Caleb's eyes flicked to the barn and then away, like someone trying to avoid a memory. Neighbors came forward with stories. A woman who ran the feed store said she had seen a van parked near the Hargreaves' drive late one night a few weeks earlier. A trucker said he had noticed a light in the barn at odd hours. A teenager swore he had heard a woman singing once, a voice that did not belong to the valley. Rumors are the first scaffolding of truth. They are also the first place where people's fears take shape. The sheriff's office, which had handled cattle disputes and the occasional bar fight, found itself in the middle of something that felt older and more dangerous. Inside the barn, beneath a pile of old feed sacks, investigators found a suitcase. It was a battered thing, the kind you buy at a discount store and keep for emergencies. Inside were clothes, some folded, some balled up, an old paperback with the spine cracked, a pair of sunglasses, and a small leather journal. The journal was filled with entries in a hurried hand, names, dates, fragments of conversations. There were mentions of hitchhiking, of a stop at a diner, of a man who offered a ride and then did not stop where he said he would. The entries stopped abruptly. The last page had a single line, "Do not trust the barn." Whoever had written it had been frightened enough to leave a warning. That warning, found in a place the family had forbidden, suggested that the barn had been a refuge and a trap at once. The travelers, as the investigation widened, the sheriff's office began to match the names on the map and in the journal with missing persons reports. Some were recent, a backpacker who had been seen hitchhiking out of state, a couple who had been traveling the country in an old RV. Others were older, cold cases that had never been solved. The valley, which had once been a place of small talk and shared tools, now found itself connected to a string of absences that stretched beyond its borders. The barn, which had been a private thing, had become a node in a network of missing people. Eli and his team worked methodically. They interviewed the Hargreaves again and again. They traced the routes on the map. They called families and followed leads. Each new piece of information was a small, sharp thing that cut away at the edges of the mystery. A neighbor named Ruth came forward with something she had kept for years, a photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded at the edges, of a group of travelers standing in front of the barn. They were laughing, arms slung around each other, the kind of easy camaraderie that forms on the road. In the background, the barn's doors were closed. On the back of the photo, in a hand that Ruth recognized as Jonah Hargreaves, was written a date and a single word: welcome. The photograph complicated everything. It suggested that the barn had not always been a place of menace. It suggested that the Hargreaves had once welcomed strangers. It suggested that something had changed. When Ruth handed the photo to Eli, her hands trembled. "They were good people," she said. "They helped when my roof caved in. They fed my cows when I was sick." But after that winter, after the accident, things were different. Accident. The word hung in the air like a loose nail. No one in the valley wanted to talk about the winter that had come 3 years earlier, the one with the blizzard and the overturned truck. But the photograph forced the memory into the light. 3 winters ago, a semi had jackknifed on the highway during a storm. The driver had died. The Hargreaves had been among the first on the scene. They had helped pull people from wreckage, had offered shelter to stranded travelers, and had taken in a young woman who had been injured. For a while, the barn had been a place of refuge. Then, in the weeks that followed, something had gone wrong. People who had been helped by the Hargreaves began to vanish. At first, it was a hitchhiker who never made it to the next town. Then a couple who had been staying in a nearby motel. The sheriff at the time had called it coincidence. The families had called it something else. Jonah Hargreaves had been questioned then, but nothing had stuck. The barn had been closed off for a time, and the Hargreaves had retreated into themselves. The valley had watched, and then, as valleys do, had turned its attention to other things. Now, with the doors open and the map and the journal and the photograph, the old winter came back like a bruise. In the loft of the barn, hidden beneath a false floorboard, investigators found a box. It contained items that belonged to different people. A necklace with a small silver locket, a child's stuffed rabbit with one eye missing, a driver's license from another state, and a cassette tape labeled Road Songs. The items were a collage of lives interrupted. The locket had a tiny photograph inside, a woman with a quick smile and a scar on her chin. The license belonged to a man who had been reported missing 2 years earlier. The rabbit had been stitched by someone who knew how to mend things. The cassette tape, when played in the sheriff's office, revealed a voice. It was a woman's voice, recorded in a low, steady tone, reading names and dates and places. At the end of the tape, the voice said, plainly, "They promised safety. They promised shelter. They took more than they gave." The tape was a confession and a warning. It suggested that the barn had been used as a ledger, a place where people's lives were catalogued and then erased. The Hargreaves' story began to unravel in small human ways. Mara, who had once been the one to bake pies for the church bake sale, had a scar on her wrist that she had hidden with bracelets. Jonah, who had been a steady hand at the feed store, had a tremor in his left hand that he blamed on an old injury. Caleb, who had been quiet and watchful, had a notebook of his own, filled with sketches of the barn and notes in a child's hand that suggested he had seen things he did not understand. When Eli asked about the scar, Mara's eyes went to the floor. "It was a bad winter," she said. "We did what we had to do." "What did you have to do?" Eli asked. Mara's mouth tightened. "Keep the family together." The phrase was small and ordinary and terrible. It suggested choices made in the dark, bargains struck to keep a household intact. It suggested that the barn had been a place where those bargains were kept. A local journalist, Hannah Price, arrived in the valley with a notebook and a camera. She had a reputation for digging where others left things alone. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She asked about the map, about the photograph, about the cassette tape. She asked about the winter and about the people who had vanished. Hannah's reporting brought attention from outside the valley. Detectives from the state came down. Cold case units were consulted. Families of the missing traveled to the farmhouse to see if the items in the box were theirs. Each new arrival was a small earthquake. One evening, Hannah knocked on the Hargreaves' door. Mara answered, and for a moment the two women looked at each other like strangers who had once shared a secret. Hannah asked if she could see the barn. Mara hesitated. Then she said, You don't want to see it? Why not? Hannah asked. Mara's voice was low.
Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Hannah, who had seen a lot, persisted.
Mara finally led her to the edge of the property and pointed.
There's a place in there that's not for outsiders, she said.
We keep it closed for a reason. Hannah left with more questions than answers. She had the look of someone who had found a thread and was about to pull. The valley's patience frayed. People who had once waved across fences now watched with narrowed eyes. The Hargreaves' mailbox was vandalized. Someone left a note on their porch. Tell us what you did. The sheriff's office received anonymous tips, some helpful, some cruel. The Hargreaves' livestock were found with fences cut. The family's dog, Maggie, disappeared for 2 days and returned with a limp. Underneath the anger and fear, there was a deeper, quieter thing. Grief. Families of the missing sat in the sheriff's office and looked at photographs and asked the same question in different ways. Why them? Why our son, our daughter, our sister?
Eli found himself thinking about the map and the journal and the cassette tape.
He thought about the photograph and the box of belongings. He thought about the way the Hargreaves had once been helpers and then had become something else. He thought about the winter and the accident and the choices people make when the world narrows to a single, urgent need. A forensic team combed the barn. They found traces of blood in a corner, old and faded but still present. They found fibers that did not match the Hargreaves' clothing. They found a set of keys with a tag that had been filed off. They found a ledger hidden in a false bottom of a feed bin with names and dates and a column marked status, left, stayed, unknown. The ledger was the most damning thing yet. It suggested deliberation, record-keeping, a system. It suggested that the barn had been used to manage people in a way that was cold and administrative. When Eli read the ledger, he felt the same chill he had felt when he first saw the map. This was not a single crime of passion. This was a pattern. Caleb Hargreaves disappeared. He was last seen walking toward the barn at dusk, a small figure against the long shadow of the ridge. The family said he had gone to check on something. The sheriff's office searched until nightfall and then again at dawn. They found his notebook on the porch, open to a page with a sketch of the barn and a single sentence. They keep a list. When the deputy found Caleb's footprints leading away from the barn and then stopping at the edge of the river, the valley held its breath. The footprints did not continue. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no sign of Caleb. The family's faces crumpled in a way that made people look away. Jonah's jaw, which had been a hard line, broke. Mara sat on the porch and did not move. The sheriff's office treated Caleb as a missing person, but everyone felt the shape of something worse. The ledger's entries began to make sense in a terrible way.
Names were crossed out.
Dates clustered around certain months. There were notations, helped with gas, gave food, sheltered, that read like kindnesses. There were other notations, kept, moved, quieted, that read like decisions. Eli and his team followed the ledger's trail. They found a shallow grave in a field 2 miles from the barn, covered with brush and the careless hand of someone who thought time would hide what they had done. The remains were fragmentary, but there were personal effects. A ring, a shoe, a fragment of a jacket. The coroner identified one of the items as belonging to a woman who had been reported missing a year earlier. The valley, which had once been a place of small certainties, now had a new certainty. The barn had been a place where people had been taken and hidden. The Hargreaves' defense was simple and human. They said they had been protecting their own. They said the winter had been brutal, that the highway had been dangerous, that people had come to them broken and desperate. They said they had tried to help, and when help failed, they had made choices they could not undo. "You don't understand what it's like," Jonah told Eli in a voice that was both pleading and defiant. "You don't know what it's like to watch your family starve, to watch your son get sick. We did what we had to do." Mara, who had once been the one to bake pies, said nothing. Her silence was a kind of confession. The defense raised a question that would haunt the investigation. At what point does protection become possession? It was a moral question dressed in the clothes of law, and it had no easy answer. Hannah Price published a piece that went beyond the ledger and the graves. She wrote about the valley's complicity, the way neighbors had looked away, the way small kindnesses had been repurposed into control. She wrote about the winter and the accident and the way trauma can calcify into rules. Her article drew attention from national outlets. It drew activists and lawyers and people who wanted to help. It also drew people who wanted to punish. The valley, which had once been a place of shared chores and potlucks, became a place of cameras and microphones and strangers who wanted to know everything. The Hargreaves retreated further. Jonah stopped going to the feed store. Mara stopped attending church. The farmhouse lights were on less often. The barn, which had been the center of everything, became a sealed thing, a wound that would not heal. The investigation widened into a network. Detectives found evidence that suggested the Hargreaves were not acting alone. There were phone records that showed calls to numbers registered to people in other counties. There were receipts for motel rooms and gas stations. There were mentions in the ledger of drivers and routes and drop points. The map, which had once been a curiosity, now looked like a blueprint. The lines on it connected to places where other travelers had vanished. The ledger's columns matched up with missing persons reports in neighboring states. The barn was not an isolated crime scene. It was a hub. Eli felt the weight of that realization. The valley had been a node in a larger system, and the system had been operating quietly for years. A woman named Isabel Alvarez arrived at the sheriff's office with a photograph and a story. Her brother Marco had been a traveler who loved the open road. He had called her from a diner near the valley and said he had been offered a place to stay. He had not been heard from since. Isabel's photograph showed Marco smiling, a backpack slung over his shoulder. She handed the photo to Eli and said, "I want to know what happened to him." Eli looked at the ledger and then at the map and felt the old chill. He promised Isabel he would find out. The coroner's report came back with a detail that made the valley shudder. The remains found in the field had been there for years. The cause of death could not be determined in every case, but there were signs of blunt force trauma and of restraint. There were also signs that some of the victims had been kept alive for a time. Scars that suggested wounds had been tended and then left to fester. The ledger's column marked status left. Stayed, unknown, took on a new, monstrous clarity. Stayed did not mean comfort. Stayed meant something else. The trial, when it came, was messy and public. The Hargreaves were charged with a string of crimes: kidnapping, manslaughter, and, in some counts, murder. The prosecution painted a picture of a family who had turned hospitality into a system of control. The defense argued that the Hargreaves had been trying to protect their own in a world that had turned against them. Witnesses testified. Families of the missing spoke with a quiet, terrible dignity. The ledger was entered into evidence. The cassette tape was played in court. The photograph of the travelers in front of the barn was shown to jurors who had never seen the valley. Caleb's disappearance remained a mystery. Some believed he had run away. Others believed he had been silenced. The Hargreaves' faces, once private and unreadable, were now public property. During the trial, a new piece of evidence emerged: a video, grainy and shot from a distance, taken by a passing motorist. It showed the barn at night, a light inside, and a figure carrying something out toward a truck. The truck's license plate was partially visible. The plate led to a man who had been arrested in another state for similar crimes. The man's arrest opened a door. He spoke, in exchange for a reduced sentence, about a network of people who had used rural properties as way stations. He named names. He described routes and drop points and the way the ledger had been used to coordinate movements. The valley, which had once been a place of small certainties, now had a new certainty. The barn had been part of a system that reached beyond its borders. The trial's verdict was complicated. Some charges stuck.
Others did not.
The Hargreaves were convicted on several counts, but the jury could not agree on everything. The sentences were long, but they did not bring back the missing. They did not answer the question of why a family that had once helped had become a family that harmed. In the aftermath, the valley tried to stitch itself back together. People mended fences and fixed roofs. They went to church and to the feed store. They tried to return to the rhythms of life. But the barn remained a scar on the landscape, a place people avoided. Years later, the barn still stood. The doors were boarded up, and a sign warned of structural instability. The Hargreaves farmhouse had been sold to a family from out of state who painted the porch a bright, defiant blue. The valley, which had once been a place of small certainties, had learned to live with a new kind of knowledge, that kindness can be twisted, that protection can become possession, and that the line between refuge and prison is sometimes drawn in the dark. Isabel Alvarez visited the valley once more. She stood at the edge of the Hargreaves' property and looked at the barn. She had found some answers, enough to bury her brother and to say his name aloud in a place where people would hear it. She had not found everything. Some names remained unaccounted for, some graves unmarked. Hannah Price wrote a book about the case, and it became required reading in criminal justice classes. Eli Mercer retired and took to fishing in the river, though he never quite lost the look of someone who had seen too much. The ledger was kept in evidence, a brittle, terrible thing that students and investigators would study for years. The valley learned to be wary of strangers and to be kinder to those who passed through. It learned that rules, like the one the Hargreaves had enforced, can be both protection and prison. It learned that silence can be a kind of violence, and the barn, which had once been a place of refuge and then a place of horror, remained a dark tooth on the ridge. People still told stories about it, but now the stories were different. They were not just warnings. They were reminders that the world is complicated, that people can be both good and terrible, and that the truth, when it comes, is often slow and stubborn and hard-won. This story is not a neat moral fable. It does not offer tidy answers or comfortable closure. It is, instead, an exploration of how ordinary lives can be bent by extraordinary circumstances, and how communities can both protect and betray. It is about the ways people keep secrets and the ways those secrets, like roots, can strangle a place. If there is a lesson here, it is this: vigilance is not the same as cruelty. Compassion is not the same as surrender. And when a family says, "Do not go near the barn," it is worth asking why, because sometimes the answer is protection, and sometimes it is something darker. The difference matters. And it is the work of a community to find out which is which. The barn remains. The valley moves on. The missing are remembered. The ledger sits in a box, brittle and yellowed, a record of choices made in the dark. And somewhere, in the quiet between seasons, the wind still comes from the east and pushes across the valley like a hand, reminding everyone that the past is never truly gone.
Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.